My name is Emily Thompson, and I am a nurse with almost a decade of experience caring for elderly patients. Recently, I started a new job at a geriatric hospital on the outskirts of Chicago, specifically in the Alzheimer's ward. The routine was exhausting but rewarding. I dedicated myself to ensuring that each patient received the care and attention they needed. Most patients liked me a lot, perhaps because of my gentle and patient approach. The hospital was an old building with narrow corridors and small rooms, which gave the place a somewhat melancholic atmosphere. There were pictures of times past on the walls, showing how the hospital had evolved over the decades. My daily routine included administering medications, monitoring patients' vital signs, and, most importantly, offering emotional comfort. Among all the patients, there was a lady named Mrs. Harriet Johnson. She was a woman in her 80s, frail in appearance, but with eyes that still shone with surprising liveliness. Unlike the others, Mrs. Johnson seemed to avoid my presence, always looking into the corner of the room, where she said she saw a man dressed in black. She often mentioned hearing voices and seeing this man, but the doctors attributed these visions to the advancement of Alzheimer's. I sympathized with her, trying to calm her down and help her sleep every night. However, her detailed descriptions and conviction in her words began to disturb me. I tried to rationalize that all of this was a product of her illness, but I couldn't help but feel a chill every time I entered her room. Everything seemed routine that night as I walked through the silent hallways of the Alzheimer's ward. The clock struck midnight when I decided to restock my supply cart in the linen room. The room was at the end of a dimly lit corridor, where the lights occasionally flickered as if they were about to go out. It was a place that always gave me an uncomfortable feeling, but I needed to finish my shift. As I organized the sheets and diapers, I felt a strange presence. The environment was too quiet, and a sudden chill ran down my spine. I continued to work, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I felt something touch my shoulder, like a cold, heavy hand. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. My heart raced, and the first thing I thought was that I was imagining things due to exhaustion. I tried to calm myself and continued organizing the supplies, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. When I finally left the linen room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the glass of the door, a man dressed in black was watching me with a sinister smile. His eyes were deep and empty, and the smile seemed more like a threat than a friendly expression. Scared, I took a step back, tripped, and fell to the floor, screaming in terror. My screams echoed down the hall, waking several patients. Another nurse, Karen, ran to me, asking what had happened. Trembling and pointing to the door, I tried to explain what I had seen, but when she looked, there was no one there. Karen tried to calm me down, but I couldn't stop shaking. My mind was a mixture of fear and confusion. Was I going crazy? The screams also woke Mrs. Johnson. When we ran to her room, she was sitting on the bed, pale and trembling. Before I could say anything, she murmured, "You saw him too, didn't you? The man in black. He's here." Her words only intensified my fear. The patient couldn't have known what I had seen, but her description confirmed everything. I began to doubt everything I believed was real. The line between hallucination and reality seemed to have disappeared. After the incident in the linen room, my anxiety increased every night. Even trying to rationalize the experience, the feeling of being watched by the man in black never completely disappeared. My performance at work began to be affected. I was constantly nervous, making small mistakes that were not common for someone with my experience. Other patients started mentioning strange things as well. Although many had dementia, their descriptions were disturbingly similar. The man in black, some said, while others spoke of whispers coming from the void. Each report made me more uneasy, and the sinister presence seemed to intensify with each shift. One night, while administering medication, I noticed that Mrs. Johnson was especially agitated. She kept looking at the corner of the room, murmuring things I couldn't fully understand. I decided to stay with her a little longer, holding her hand and trying to calm her down. Suddenly, she squeezed my hand tightly, and her eyes widened, fixed on the corner of the room. "He's here," she whispered. "He's right there." The fear in her eyes was so real that I slowly turned, expecting to see the man in black again. The corner was empty, but the feeling of cold was palpable. My heart was beating so fast I thought I would faint. I tried to calm Mrs. Johnson, but it was as if the whole room was enveloped in a haze of terror. Her hands were cold, and she began to cry, begging for the man to go away. The tension grew throughout the night. Other patients were restless, some crying for no apparent reason, and the hospital's atmosphere was heavier than ever. I felt watched everywhere, even in the lit hallways. The feeling of being followed was constant, and I found myself looking back every few steps. My colleagues noticed my change in behavior. Karen, who had helped me on the night of the incident, tried to talk to me several times, suggesting I take a few days off. But I couldn't leave my patients. I felt an enormous responsibility, especially for Mrs. Johnson. However, the doubt about my sanity was growing. Was it all just a product of my tired mind? Or was there really something very wrong in that hospital? The night that would seal my fate at the hospital began like any other. I was more nervous than usual, but determined to finish my shift without incident. During the night rounds, the hallways were quieter than usual, which only increased my sense of unease. As I passed by Mrs. Johnson's room, I heard a strange sound coming from inside. It sounded like a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. I opened the door slowly and found her sitting on the bed, eyes wide open, fixed on the corner of the room. "He's here," she murmured again with a voice full of dread. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. I felt a presence behind me and turned slowly. There he was, the man in black, clearer than ever. He stood in the corner, looking directly at me with that sinister smile. My body froze and I couldn't move a muscle. Panic took over me. I started to scream, and the man in black took a step forward but disappeared before reaching me. I fell to my knees, crying and shaking. Mrs. Johnson was also screaming, in a state of complete terror. Other nurses, including Karen, ran into the room. They tried to lift me, but I was in shock, unable to explain what had happened. The doctors were called, and after some time they managed to calm me down enough to talk. I told them what I saw, but I knew it sounded like the delusion of an exhausted mind. Karen tried to console me, but her eyes showed genuine concern. The decision was made to transfer me to another ward, away from that room and corridor. That night was etched into my memory. The next day, I submitted my resignation letter. It would be my second to last shift at the hospital. I had never experienced hallucinations or mental problems before, and the experience shook me deeply. Even now, I still question if it was real or a product of my tired mind. However, the feeling of the hand on my shoulder and the sight of the man in black are vivid and terrifying memories that remain. I left the hospital with a mix of relief and unease, feeling that the mystery of the man in black would never be solved. I left behind a job, but carried with me a story I would never forget, always wondering if he is still there, watching and waiting. My wife and I, newlyweds, were excited about our new life together. We had moved to a small town in Georgia, where we bought a cozy house surrounded by trees and a large backyard. The town was quiet, with friendly neighbors and a slower pace of life, perfect for starting our journey together. We arrived at our new home on a sunny Saturday afternoon, full of expectations and dreams. The house was exactly as we had imagined, a classic structure with a charming porch and a well-kept garden. We spent the weekend unpacking our things, arranging the furniture, and making the place truly ours. The first days were a mix of hard work and satisfaction. We set up the furniture, decorated the rooms, and began getting to know the neighborhood. In the evenings, we relaxed on the couch, watching movies and planning for the future. Everything seemed perfect, as if we were living a dream. Georgia was an enchanting place, with its southern hospitality and stunning landscapes. We took the opportunity to explore the town, visiting local shops and getting to know the neighbors. Everyone was very welcoming and gave us tips on the best places to eat and visit. Our backyard was a peaceful haven, with a view of the forest stretching beyond the fence. We listened to the sounds of nature as we sat on the porch at night, enjoying the peace we had longed for. Our routine began to settle, and soon we truly felt at home. On the third night, we were comfortably settled in the living room. watching one of our favorite shows on TV. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the television and the occasional creaking of the trees outside. It was then that I heard a strange sound coming from the backyard. A vintage song, accompanied by a faint static, interrupted our tranquility. "Are you hearing this?" I asked my wife, frowning in concern. She nodded, her eyes wide with surprise. The music seemed to come from the nearby forest, an old melody that sounded like it was coming from a 1950s radio. I got up, determined to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the backyard. The music became clearer as I approached the fence, separating our yard from the forest. The sound seemed to emanate from the depths of the woods. I looked around, searching for any signs of movement or the source of the sound, but found nothing. "This looks like some kind of prank," I thought to myself, trying to calm the sense of unease that was starting to grow inside me. I went back inside, trying to ignore the music I could still faintly hear. It was nothing, probably just some teenagers playing pranks, I told my wife, trying to sound more confident than I really was. She agreed, but we both knew something was out of the ordinary. We tried to resume our evening, but the persistent music and the unsettling feeling of not knowing what was happening made it difficult to relax. We went to bed early, hoping that the sound would disappear and that we could wake up the next day without any memory of the strange event. On the fourth night, the vintage music returned. This time it was even louder, penetrating the walls of the house with disturbing clarity. My wife and I were in the kitchen when we heard the familiar melody and increasing static. We looked at each other, discomfort visible on our faces. "I'll go take a look," I said, grabbing the flashlight once more. I went out to the backyard, my wife following closely behind. The music seemed to guide us to a specific spot on the grass, where something small gleamed under the flashlight's beam. I approached carefully, and to my surprise, I found an old radio playing the music. The radio was an antique model, with a large dial and heavy buttons. It was clearly out of place there in the middle of the yard. I picked up the radio, trying to turn it off, but the buttons seemed stuck. That's when I heard my wife scream, "Run! Run! There are people in the woods!" I looked in the direction she was pointing and saw 3 figures standing among the trees. They were motionless, as if watching us. A primal fear took hold of me. I held the radio and ran back to the house, my wife already at the door calling me desperately. We slammed the door shut and locked all the entrances. Our hearts were racing, and our minds were filled with unanswered questions. Who were those people, and why were they stalking us? We immediately called the police, explaining the situation with trembling voices. The officers arrived quickly, and we handed them the radio, hoping they could find some clue. They inspected the area around the forest with powerful flashlights, but found no one. They came back to reassure us, saying it was probably just teenagers playing pranks, but the explanation didn't convince us. The serious expression on the officers' faces as they took the radio showed that they were also perplexed. We spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting in the living room, unable to return to the bedroom. The fear that those figures might return kept us on edge, every sound amplified by the silence of the night. The radio, now in the hands of the police, seemed to carry more questions than answers. Parsonfield Lake in Maine has always been my refuge. The tranquility of the waters reflecting the blue sky and the surrounding forest offered me an indescribable peace. On days when I needed to escape from the world, that was my destination. There, the only concern was what bait to use to attract the trout. Sitting on the lake's shore, fishing rod firmly in hand, I felt as though nothing could disturb that perfect balance. The connection I felt with nature was profound. The sounds of the forest, the birds singing, and even the rustling of leaves in the wind brought me comfort. That place seemed isolated from the rest of the world, a secret hideaway just for me. There was something special about that environment, a feeling that time passed differently, more slowly, allowing me to appreciate each moment. Little did I know that this serenity would be short-lived, an illusion before the storm. Sometimes, while I was at the lake, I felt a presence, as if I was being watched. It wasn't a constant feeling, but when it emerged, it made me question my sanity. It was almost as if nature itself was warning me of something. I dismissed it as paranoia, a result of being so immersed in my own thoughts. However, this feeling became increasingly difficult to ignore until I finally realized I was not alone. That summer, the heat was intense, but I didn't mind. The hot sun on my skin was comforting as I cast my line into the calm waters. As day turned to night, a gentle breeze began to blow, bringing with it a subtle omen of change. At that moment, I was oblivious to the fact that the night would become one of the most disturbing of my life, challenging everything I thought I knew about that peaceful lake. One moment, I was relaxed, almost dozing off to the gentle sound of the water, and the next, I felt a restlessness. My eyes opened, and looking around, everything seemed normal except for a persistent feeling that something was about to happen. The world around me seemed to fall silent, a heavy silence that precedes the arrival of a storm. The tranquil refuge was about to reveal a dark side that I could never have anticipated. Night fell quickly, enveloping the lake in deep shadows. With the trout already caught, I was about to pack up my gear when a movement on the other side of the lake caught my attention. A figure, almost invisible in the darkness, was moving slowly. My instincts alerted me to danger, and my heart began to beat faster. Watching closely, I saw that the person was dumping something from a barrel into the water. The dark liquid stained the lake's calm surface. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to understand what was happening. What was that person dumping in the lake? Why would someone do something like this in such an isolated place? My first instinct was to confront him, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the fear of the unknown or the realization that it could be dangerous. Despite this, I took a step toward him, hoping to get some explanation. But before I could say anything, he noticed me. The mysterious figure froze for a moment upon noticing my presence. Then, he turned and ran into the forest, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow. I stood paralyzed for a moment, processing what had just happened. Silence fell over the lake once more, but it was a restless silence, heavy with unanswered questions. Something terrible had just occurred before my eyes, and I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I decided to head home, but the peace I used to feel had evaporated. Walking back, every sound in the forest seemed amplified, every shadow more threatening. My hands shook as I held my fishing gear, and the desire to forget what I had seen fought against the need to understand. When I reached the safety of my home, I locked all the doors and windows, trying to protect myself from something I couldn't define. That night, as I lay in bed, the scene replayed in my mind. The barrel, the liquid, the flight. I had to find out what was happening at that lake. But the prospect of going back and investigating on my own was terrifying. The mysterious figure continued to loom in my thoughts, a veiled threat. The only certainty was that the tranquility of my refuge had been irrevocably broken, replaced by a persistent fear of the unknown. The way back home that night seemed longer than usual. The trees along the trail seemed to close in around me, as if the forest knew what I had witnessed and wanted to protect me. But the protection was an illusion, a feeble attempt to escape the reality of what I had seen at the lake. When I entered my house, I locked the door behind me with a resounding click, hoping that a physical barrier could contain the growing terror within me. The security of familiar walls did little to calm my nerves. After warming up a quick meal, I went to the window, cautiously pulling the curtain, expecting to see the man lurking in the darkness. That was when I heard the knocks. First on the door, then on the window. Each knock echoed through the house, a strident reminder that I was no longer alone in my refuge. A muffled voice, almost desperate, pleaded for me to listen, but prudence outweighed curiosity. "Go away!" I shouted, my tone resonating more with fear than with anger. The figure from the lake insisted from outside, trying to explain his actions, but I was not swayed. My heart pounded in my chest as I threatened to call the police, each word an attempt to fend off the looming terror. Silence finally reigned again, but it was only a temporary truce. The stranger had retreated, but the sense of danger was far from gone. After that attempt at contact, the reality of the situation began to set in. I was alone, and the sense of security had dissipated like morning fog. Aware that the stranger could return at any moment, I took measures to fortify my home. I locked the windows more tightly, reviewing every lock, every barrier that could turn my home into a fortress against the threat that lingered outside. Yet paranoia continued to take hold of me. In the silence of the night, every sound seemed suspicious. Even the creaking floorboards under my feet left me anxious. The night became an endless vigil, each minute stretched by oppressive anticipation. I didn't sleep much, but when I finally did, I dreamed of shadows trying to get in, of a figure chasing me by the lake. The peace the lake had offered me for so long was now tainted by the presence of the stranger and the fear of what he might do. The next morning arrived slowly, bringing with it a renewed determination to find answers. After a restless night, what I had witnessed could not be ignored. I decided that the only way forward was to report the incident to the Department of Environmental Protection. I picked up the phone, each button pressed with significant weight. Explaining what I had seen was an exercise in patience and frustration, as the skepticism on the other end of the line was palpable. "What exactly did you see?" questioned the agent with a voice that conveyed doubt. The lack of concrete evidence made my story hard to believe, and the conversation ended with a loose promise to investigate. Feeling helpless, I realized I couldn't rely solely on the authorities to solve the mystery of the lake. I needed to go back there, to look with my own eyes, even though the idea filled me with dread. I returned to the lake during the day when the sunlight made the forest seem less threatening. The water, usually so clear and inviting, now seemed to hide secrets beneath its surface. I scoured the area where the stranger had been, looking for any sign of disturbance. However, the barrel and its contents had completely disappeared, as if the scene from the previous night had been nothing but a nightmare. With the mystery still on my mind, I decided to seek advice and stories from the local residents. I visited the small-town shop, where conversation flowed more easily among the regulars. Amid casual chatter, I heard whispers of other stories about strange events around the lake. Each account carried an air of uncertainty, mixing facts with speculation, but all reinforced the feeling that something sinister was at play. As the sun began to set, one thing became clear. The lake was not the sanctuary I thought it was. The stories from other residents only deepened the mystery and my determination to understand what was really going on. With questions still hanging over my head and a promise to investigate further, I returned home, knowing this was only the beginning of a path full of uncertainties and dangers. Time seemed to pass slowly after I reported the incident at the lake. Every sound around my house put me on edge, expecting another appearance from the stranger. It was on a gray afternoon that the threat materialized again. I was chopping wood in the yard when a disconcerting feeling of being watched overtook me. Looking around, I spotted the same figure in the distance, watching me from the shadow of the trees. He wasn't just observing, he seemed deliberately wanting me to see him. The stranger's posture was more aggressive this time, almost challenging. I felt a chill run down my spine as he took a few steps toward me. My mind went on high alert, and the urgency to defend myself took over. I dropped the axe and ran inside, locking the door behind me with a racing heart. Through the window, I saw that he hadn't backed down. The figure lingered at the edge of the forest, a sinister presence reminding me that the nightmare was far from over. I grabbed the gun I kept for emergencies, trying to muster the courage to confront my pursuer. The fear was palpable, but the need to protect my home and my own life drove me to face that threat head-on. I made a decision at that moment. I opened the door and took a few cautious steps toward the forest. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice carrying more bravado than I actually felt. The stranger, realizing I was armed, hesitated for a moment before muttering something I couldn't fully comprehend. It seemed like an attempt at communication, but the urgency in his voice was undeniable. Before I could demand further explanations, he turned and disappeared among the trees. It was clear that something deeper was at play, something he was desperate to protect or conceal. As I walked back inside, the reality of my situation weighed on me. The fear and paranoia were intensifying, and I knew I needed more support. The security I once felt in my home was irreparably compromised. With the stranger once again vanished into the forest, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and doubts. I couldn't sleep that night, listening to the nighttime sounds that seemed to grow closer. I knew I needed help, someone who could offer me advice and support. The next morning, I decided to call my brothers, people I have always trusted to handle difficult situations. My brothers arrived that same afternoon, bringing with them a sense of safety and familiarity. I explained everything that had happened, from the initial encounter at the lake to the recent confrontation. Together, we decided to reinforce the security measures in my home. As we worked, the weight of what we were facing became even clearer. It was as if we were preparing for an invisible war against an unknown threat. During the conversation, one of my brothers suggested that perhaps we should search for more tangible evidence at the lake. The idea of returning to the site was not exactly comforting, but it seemed the only way to discover more. The next morning, with the first rays of sun, the three of us set out for the lake. The atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation as we approached the water. As soon as we arrived, an unexpected discovery awaited us. Floating at the shore was a personal item that didn't belong to any of us. It was a glove, soaked and worn but still intact. The find made us question whether it had been left intentionally or accidentally lost by the stranger. Either way, it was another piece of the puzzle we were trying to assemble. The discovery raised even more suspicions about what was really happening at the lake. The idea that the barrel might contain human remains seemed less absurd and more sinister with each new clue that emerged. As we left the lake, the presence of the stranger still loomed over us, a shadow that followed every step we took. The mystery only deepened, and we knew more revelations and challenges awaited on the path ahead. The morning after our discovery, the tension was palpable. The stranger's presence continued to hover over us like a shadow. We knew he would return. I spent the day preparing for an inevitable confrontation. My heart beat strongly in my chest as I checked the locks and reviewed the plan with my brothers. We were determined to face the stranger, whatever the reason for his persistence. As the sun set, darkening the sky and casting shadows across the house, a sound on the porch alerted us that the threat had returned. Peeking through the window, I saw the stranger, more determined than ever. This time he wasn't just watching, he was approaching, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight. Time seemed to stand still as we prepared for the inevitable confrontation. My heart was in my throat, but the determination to protect what was mine kept me steady. I armed myself with what I could and went out to confront him, my brothers right behind me. "Why are you here?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the silent night. The stranger stopped, his eyes full of an urgency that almost disarmed me. He tried to speak, but his voice was full of despair and fear. Before I could understand what he was trying to communicate, a muffled scream escaped his mouth, and he took a step back. With a quick decision, I called the police, reporting the latest encounter and the discovery of the glove. As I spoke, the stranger began to retreat, realizing he was at a disadvantage. But instead of fleeing immediately, he gestured desperately toward the lake, as if trying to make me understand something deeper. However, fear overcame him, and he disappeared into the trees, leaving a sense of unresolved mystery in the air. The police arrived shortly after the stranger's departure, their flashing lights breaking the darkness. I reported what had occurred, handing over the glove as evidence. Their presence gave me a temporary sense of security, but the questions continued to swirl in my mind. What did the stranger want to say? What was his true purpose? As the night wore on, the tension began to wane, but the mystery of the lake remained, a constant and unsettling presence that promised more challenges. The days following the confrontation were filled with a strange mix of relief and unease. The police presence helped restore some sense of security, but the lake's mystery still hung in the air. There was no sign of the stranger, and the authorities were unable to find any concrete clues to explain his actions. However, the feeling that the lake held dark secrets was undeniable, a reality that could not be ignored. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that the experience had changed my perspective in many ways. The peace I once found at the lake was stained by the presence of the unknown, and my refuge had become a place of distrust and fear. Having my brothers by my side gave me strength to face these challenges, but the reality was that uncertainty continued to hover over us, like a storm that refused to pass. I decided to return to the lake, even though the fear of finding something even more disturbing plagued me. The water was calm, reflecting the sky above, but something still felt wrong. I looked around, searching for any sign of the stranger or the missing barrel. Although I found nothing concrete, the feeling that the lake still held its secrets left me uneasy. It was as if nature was conspiring to keep the mystery hidden. The incident taught me about the fragility of security and the complexity of fear. Even with the stranger gone, the sense of danger still lingered, and the tranquility that once characterized my life seemed distant. As I walked along the shore, I realized that the true terror was not in the presence of the stranger, but in the secrets he seemed to guard. It was as if the lake had become a character in its own right, an entity that kept its mystery firmly hidden. With the investigation still open and unanswered questions, the lake remained a constant presence in my thoughts. The mystery of what really happened that night continued to haunt me, but it also sparked an insatiable curiosity. I knew that somehow I would have to face the truth, but I also understood that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. The lake, with all its secrets, had become a part of me, a perpetual reminder that sometimes the true terror lies in what we cannot see or fully understand. On the last day of school, the bell rang, releasing a wave of relief and anticipation within me and my friends. Rachel, Lucas, and of course Tyler, the unofficial leader of our quartet. We had already planned to kick off the summer with a trip to the beach, but as the sky filled with dark clouds, our plans faded. As we gathered in the parking lot, watching the weather change, Tyler, always ready for an adventure, suggested a daring alternative. "How about we explore that abandoned elementary school on Old Cedar Road?" he proposed with a mix of excitement and challenge. At first, there was hesitation, especially from Rachel, who was more cautious. But curiosity overcame fear, and the stories circulating about the old building only added spice to our adventure. With the beach out of the question, the idea of exploring seemed irresistibly tempting. "It'll be an adventure," Tyler insisted, capturing our uncertain glances. Convinced and somewhat impulsive, we decided to go ahead, despite the whispered warnings in our minds. The drive to the school was marked by a torrential downpour that began to fall heavily, pounding on the car roof with a steady rhythm. That sound felt like a prelude to the unknown, but our adrenaline was high, fueled by the promise of an unforgettable story. Tyler drove confidently, while Lucas cracked jokes to ease the tension, and Rachel nervously gazed out the window, her thoughts clearly troubled by what lay ahead. When we arrived, the school building stood tall and solitary, with broken windows staring at us like empty eyes from a forgotten face. Its weathered brick walls and the corroded metal fence around it seemed even more sinister under the shroud of the stormy sky. Tyler, with his usual enthusiasm, was the first to get out of the car. He found a spot in the fence where the wires were spread wide enough for us to pass through. "Let's do this," he declared, and one by one, we crossed onto the property of the abandoned school, our hearts pounding with the thrill of adventure and the fear none of us wanted to admit. Tyler led the way to one of the building's low windows, already partially broken. Carefully ensuring we weren't being watched, he helped us climb in one by one. Passing through the window felt like stepping into a world forgotten by time, still breathing the secrets of its past. The smell of mold was palpable, mingling with the aroma of rotting wood emanating from the peeling walls. Lucas was the first to turn on his phone's flashlight, cutting through the darkness with a beam of light that revealed long hallways, stretching like the tentacles of a sleeping creature. The shadows cast by the light danced on the walls, and every sound amplified in the silence that surrounded us. "This place is massive," Rachel murmured, her voice a fearful whisper that seemed unwilling to awaken something sleeping. Echoes of our footsteps followed us, a constant reminder that we were alone, or so we hoped. As we explored, we found classrooms that still bore traces of their previous purpose. Desks lined up in ghostly rows, chalkboards covered with words faded by time. It was like walking through a time capsule, each room silently telling stories of laughter and learning that once filled these spaces. But now, all that remained was the echo of an absent presence that somehow still seemed to watch us. The main hallway led to the auditorium, a large space that once must have hosted lively events and now only hosted shadows. As we approached, a distant sound broke the constancy of silence, something that sounded like the dragging of feet or an almost inaudible sigh. We stopped, our hearts beating faster, exchanging glances in silence. Rationality told us it was just the building settling, but fear suggested something more. With a nod from Tyler, we continued, each step a test of our courage. As we ventured through the auditorium, the flashlights revealed more than just debris and dust. Faded posters of school plays still adorned the walls, and on the stage, a torn backdrop hung forlornly. Lucas, with his usual enthusiasm for ghost stories, began to weave a spooky tale about the students who might still haunt the place. Rachel, however, was not amused. "Let's focus on getting out of here after a quick look around," she insisted, clearly uncomfortable with the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. While we were exploring the stage, a sound of something being dragged froze us again. Tyler pointed his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there but torn curtains. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, and each of us exchanged nervous looks. "It's probably just some rat," Tyler tried to reassure the group, though his voice betrayed a hint of doubt. The tension among us was growing, fueled not only by unexplained sounds, but also by the feeling that we were being watched. We decided to keep going, moving toward the back of the building where the science classroom still housed tables and old equipment. As we walked, the occasional sound of breaking glass under our feet echoed ominously through the empty corridors. "Imagine all the experiments that were done here," said Lucas, trying to lighten the mood with his usual humor. However, even his jokes couldn't pierce the layer of fear that had settled. When we reached the library, a cold wind surprised us, making sheets of paper fly through the air as if they were fleeting specters. The place was a mess, with books scattered and shelves toppled over. Rachel, always the most rational, commented on how the deterioration was a sad testament to abandonment. Yet, the way the pages moved, almost with urgency, made it seem as though the place still had stories to tell, stories we might prefer not to know. Despite the growing discomfort, the group decided to delve deeper into the school, driven by curiosity and the desire not to leave the adventure unfinished. Our next stop was the gymnasium, a vast, echoing space where the sound of our footsteps seemed to multiply. Tyler was the first to enter, followed closely by me, while Rachel and Lucas hesitated at the entrance. The floor was covered in dust and debris, but what really caught our attention were marks in the dust that seemed like recent drag marks. "Someone's been here," murmured Tyler, bending down to examine the marks more closely. The air grew heavy with the realization that we weren't alone, or at least weren't the only recent visitors. The thought that someone or something might be sharing the space with us was unsettling, and Rachel finally voiced the thought that hung over us all. Maybe we should leave. But curiosity kept us there, at least for a little longer. We explored the locker rooms, where we found more disturbing signs. A torn backpack, as if someone had left in a hurry, and a broken toy, which was strangely out of place. The atmosphere was laden with a silent urgency that seemed to push us forward, against our better judgment. Lucas, trying to keep the adventurous spirit alive, suggested we head to the cafeteria, a place where we could at least sit down and rest a bit. When we entered the cafeteria, the smell of mold was oppressive, and the silence was only broken by the dripping of water from somewhere within the walls. The tables were arranged chaotically, as if a sudden evacuation had occurred. Among them, we found an old newspaper, its faded words speaking of events and mundane concerns from a time that no longer existed. It was a reminder that despite the abandonment, this place once had life, and now only held echoes of its vibrant past. Continuing our exploration, we decided the next stop would be the kindergarten wing, a place we imagined to be less gloomy. As we entered the first room, we were greeted by colorful walls and decorations that still hung. trying to maintain the cheerful spirit of a more innocent time. However, even those vibrant colors couldn't mask the sense of abandonment that permeated the air. Rachel, upon seeing children's drawings still attached to the wall, softly commented, "It's sad to think of all the memories left behind." As we moved through the room, Tyler abruptly stopped, signaling for us to remain silent. He pointed to the window overlooking the outer corridor, where a figure quickly passed by in the distance. With our hearts pounding, we hesitated, our eyes fixed on the distant figure. "Did you see that?" Lucas whispered, his voice laden with tension. It was clearly a man, tall and thin, now standing and watching us in return. No one dared to respond, but we knew the adventure had taken a turn none of us expected. We chose to continue, driven by a mix of fear and a need to discover who or what was with us in that abandoned building. Cautiously opening the door, we found a room empty except for an overturned toy cabinet and toys scattered on the floor. The silence was deafening, and our every movement seemed too loud, every whisper a shout in the oppressive quiet. Just as we were about to leave the room, a loud noise came from the hallway, as if something heavy had fallen. Our bodies reacted before we even processed the sound, instinctively looking toward the source. At the end of the hallway, a man with a baseball bat was standing, staring at us with an intense and unsettling expression. Before we could process what was happening, the man began walking toward us, hitting the baseball bat against the walls as he advanced. The metallic sound of the bat against concrete echoed through the building, amplifying our fear with each strike. His expression was inscrutable, but his intentions seemed clear. "We need to get out of here now," whispered Tyler, pulling Rachel by the arm as Lucas and I followed closely. We ran down the hallway, our hurried and desperate steps seeking the nearest exit. The sound of the bat grew louder, almost as if the man was enjoying the fear he was provoking. Each hit reverberated in our chests, driving us to run faster. "This way," shouted Rachel, pointing to a dimly lit emergency exit at the end of a side hallway. When we reached the door, our relief was immediate but brief. The door was locked, and none of us had thought to bring anything to force it open. "We have to find another way," said Lucas, looking around, searching for another exit. Our breaths were heavy, mingling with the constant sound of the bat hitting the walls, a constant reminder of the threat that followed us. We decided to double back and try the back door of the gymnasium, remembering there was an exit that might be unblocked. As we retraced our steps, the sound of the blows began to fade, giving us hope that maybe we had lost our pursuer. But the relief was short-lived. Turning a corner, the sound intensified again, closer than ever. Reaching the gym door, we pushed hard, relieved to find it unlocked. We burst out into the fresh night air, the cold wind hitting our sweaty faces. Without hesitation, we kept running towards the street, not looking back. The moonlight illuminated our path, and only when we reached the perceived safety of Tyler's car did we allow ourselves to stop and catch our breath, each of us processing the terror we had just escaped. After escaping to the parking lot, we stood there, outside, leaning against the vehicle, trying to catch our breath. The silence among us was loaded, each processing the terror we had just experienced. As we breathed the fresh night air, our eyes were fixed on the dark silhouette of the school under the pale moonlight, which now seemed even more threatening. Then suddenly, the silhouette of the man with the bat appeared in the doorway through which we had exited. He stood there, motionless, just watching us from a distance. His gaze seemed to pierce the darkness, fixing on us with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. He made no move to follow us, just stood there as if marking his presence, reminding us that this was his territory. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly turned and walked back into the school, disappearing into the darkness of the building. The echo of his footsteps being muffled by the door closing seemed a clear signal that this night of horrors had ended, but his image standing in the doorway remained etched in our minds. We looked at each other, the adrenaline from the escape slowly being replaced by a heavy silence and a disturbing realization. The adventure was over, but the memories of what we had experienced in that abandoned school would haunt us for a long time. With a collective sigh, we decided it was time to leave. Slowly, we got into Tyler's car, leaving behind the school and its sinister figure. After that night, none of us could completely forget what had happened. The following weeks were filled with conversations, trying to understand who the man was and why he was so fiercely protecting that abandoned place. But despite our curiosity, none of us dared to return to the school. A few months later, we learned through local news that the abandoned elementary school would be demolished to make way for a new community park. On the day of the demolition, we felt a mix of relief and melancholy. We decided to watch from a distance, a way to close that chapter of our lives. As the demolition machine tore down the walls and crushed the concrete, each blow seemed to release a bit of the weight we carried. When the dust settled, the ground where the school once stood was now just a pile of rubble. The man with the bat was never seen again, and no explanation about his presence or behavior reached us. Perhaps he was just a guardian of forgotten memories, or maybe something more, an echo of the stories those corridors knew. The new park was completed a few months later. With green spaces, benches, and a small playground, the place became a gathering point for neighborhood families and children. Visiting the park on a sunny afternoon, we saw children playing where dark hallways once stood. It was hard to imagine that the same ground now covered with laughter had once been a stage of so much fear. This transformation of the place brought us a certain peace. After all, the frightening memories of that night finally began to fade, replaced by scenes of joy and community.